I'm going to go over one of the most asked for tools that I've created for this community, for pastors in particular. And it's the housing allowance optimization tool. It's an Excel spreadsheet. You can download exactly what you see here today in this video, and you can get to work on it. So I'd like to do a demonstration of exactly how that works. Before we jump into it, again, a preface of what this is. This is a housing allowance optimization tool. A housing allowance, for those that don't know, is a specific provision that only pastors get, specifically ministers of the gospel, as it says in in the IRS code. And it allows pastors to take an exclusion from their income. That means that this part of their income is not taxed for income tax. They can exclude a part of their income that represents their housing expenses. There are a few guardrails in place just to make sure that people aren't going crazy and erasing essentially their entire income from this benefit. But there's essentially three values that you need to calculate, and you get to take the lesser of the three. The three values are, first, what's actually officially designated as a housing allowance by your church. So this should be happening every year. Your church board should be getting together, probably the last meeting of the year, whether that's in December or November. I know that some boards take December off for holidays and such. I serve a church where we do that. So you got to think ahead. For us, this would be every November. The pastor should be coming to the board and should be requesting a housing allowance for the next year. Again, that's a dollar amount, and it's a portion of their total W-2 pay from the church. So if you have a pastor who is paid $50,000 from the church and they have $20,000 in housing expenses estimated, they can go to the church and they can request that $20,000 of their total $50,000 would be officially designated as a housing allowance. And that would exclude that $20,000 from taxable income to that pastor when it comes to calculating their income taxes. So it's an insanely good benefit. Again, it's a benefit that only pastors get. And almost every pastor that I know has at least heard of the housing allowance and is doing their best to optimize it. What I've found, though, is that pastors tend to fall into one of two camps, because pastors may do a good job telling each other about the housing allowance and kind of sharing what they've done. But I've found that there seems to be a lack of fundamental understanding as of exactly what the housing allowance is, what counts towards it, what doesn't count toward it, because there are some things that don't count, and how to optimize it for your particular situation. And so you kind of have these two camps of pastors. One just plays it safe, says, you know what, I could probably count this expense towards my housing allowance, let's say like fertilizer for your lawn. Someone would look at that and be like, oh, is this considered a housing expense or not? I don't know. I'm just going to play it safe. I'm not going to count it. And then they end up leaving money on the table. So that's kind of one camp of pastors. The other camp of pastors are those that just go for broke and be like, I'm getting this tax benefit. I'm milking every single dollar that I can out of this. And I'm going to count everything. I'm going to count housekeepers. I'm going to take out a HELOC. I'm going to count that. And they end up kind of playing fast and loose with the rules, and they end up sleeping with one eye open in case the IRS comes knocking. So I think that there's a good middle ground. If you are thoroughly and fully educated on exactly what the housing allowance is, exactly what it isn't, exactly what it does for you, exactly what it doesn't do for you, and if you have a tool that helps keep you honest and helps you optimize what your actual allowance is, then you can come boldly before your board at the end of every year and know exactly the housing allowance that you should request. So I was talking about the three values. So that's the official designation of the church. And the church isn't going to take the initiative on that, by the way. That's something that you as a pastor should be doing. You should be coming to the church and be identifying your own housing allowance based off of your needs and your housing situation. That's not on the church to try to read the crystal ball and try to figure out what that is for you. So I want to empower you to come up with the right value. The second value that you need to know is your actual housing expenses. And I've mentioned this a few times. Even if your church designates a really high housing allowance, say you only have $20,000 in expenses, but to play it safe, they give you $30,000. They say, hey, we want to give you the most possible benefit. Go ahead and take $30,000 of your $50,000 salary as a housing allowance. Sounds good. except when it actually comes down to taking your tax benefit when you're filing, you can only take the lesser of those two. So if you only spent 20,000, it does you can only take the 20,000 even if your church gave you 30,000 as an allowance. And that means that that extra $10,000 becomes fully taxable income, and that's a bad surprise that nobody wants around tax time. So let's plan ahead and let's make sure that we're right sizing our housing allowance according to our actual expenses, and that's what the tool helps you do here. The third is something called the fair rental value. And this is kind of the more complicated one. Nowadays, it's super easy. And I'm going to show you my method. And again, it's built into the tool. It prompts you exactly what you should be doing to do your own due diligence in your research. It should take you 10 to 15 minutes a year to find a fair rental value for your residence, and to have good documentation to hold up in case the IRS decides to come knocking and give you that dreaded audit. So I want to make my pastors that I work with as audit proof as possible. And so it's all about documentation, documentation, documentation. So that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to tell you exactly how to determine the fair rental value. And again, that's furnished plus utilities. Those are important caveats to throw in there. You can't just go on Zillow, for instance, and look at the rent estimate and be, I'm done. That's my fair rental value. Well, then you're leaving money on the table because it says specifically in the IRS code, furnished plus utilities. And I'll show you again in the tool exactly how to capture those. All right. So again, recap, you have three values: your designated housing allowance from your church, which again can be whatever you ask them to do as long as it's in writing and officially designated. The second is your actual housing expenses for the year. And the third is the fair rental value of your home, furnished plus utilities. You can take the lesser of these three. In the book, I talk about this as thinking about a three-legged stool. You can only sit as high as the shortest leg. And so that's how it works. So let's look at the tool. And again, this is a Excel spreadsheet. Let's go ahead and bring this up. All right, so here you should be able to see it on your screen. This is our housing allowance worksheet. And again, if you are a member of the community, then you can go to shepherdswallet.com/join to join the community and have access to this tool. The first thing you'll notice here is that we have a few tabs here at the bottom. It starts you off on the housing summary, and every one of these colored boxes, and you're going to have to roll with me here. I'm colorblind. I don't actually know what color this is. Is it green? I don't know. But whatever, let's say it's green. Okay, so what these green boxes here, these are your actual inputs. So these are the ones that you would put values in order to change. Everything else is calculated for you. So you shouldn't have to mess with anything else. So this is this first, and the sections here is that you put in your information, what tax year you're requesting, the name of your church. I called it the Big Happy Church. Those of you that get it. It's kind of an inside joke for me and my pastor buddies. And then the home address, and that's just for your knowledge. And then this helps you kind of walk through what your actual housing expenses are for the year, and this is going to help you estimate next year's allowance, and also provide documentation for this year's allowance. You know, for this year, you have your actual housing expenses. You say this is what it is, and this will also help you for next year ask for a housing allowance that's in line with your spending. So that's what this section helps you do. This helps you find out what the fair rental value of your home is, and we have a few ways of doing that research. And so that's what that is. Let's talk about these other tabs. We have an analysis tab. We'll talk about this in a minute, but once we fill it out, it won't mean much before we do that. But for now, this kind of shows you your quote unused or your excess housing allowance. It shows you how much more housing allowance you could justify based on the fair rental of your home. And essentially what it shows is how much extra could you spend on housing expenses every month or every year and still have that qualify for your tax deduction, or it's an exclusion, not a deduction. And then we have a couple tabs here. We have an allowance request tab, and then we have a board resolution tab. And both of these are to help your church. We want to make it as easy for your church board as possible to take care of you. And so this one is essentially a formal letter that's written from your point of view to the church, officially requesting the housing allowance. It calls out Section 107 from the IRS code so that they can do their due diligence. If your church has never given you a housing allowance before, This should be able to help you do that. And then at the end, it puts in how much you're asking for. You sign your name. They could even just sign their name at the bottom, whether it's the president or the treasurer, whoever it is, and they can do that. Another one, if your board wants to really make it official, you can give them this. It's an official board resolution. You can put the date of whatever the meeting is that they meet to make this resolution. And this is, again, from the point of view of the board, making a formal resolution. We hereby resolve that, Pastor John Doe, we're designating this portion of his pay to be housing allowance. And if they want that formal language, then you can have it here. And of course, we have some important disclosures over here that you can look at as well. Let's go back to the first housing summary here. So let's go ahead and fill this out as if we actually are, trying to calculate our housing expenses for the year. So again, this is Pastor John Doe working at the Big Happy Church. First thing it asks for is your monthly rent or mortgage payment. This is set to monthly, so I'm going to put in $2,000. And you can see up here on this annual amount, this is going to update as we fill this in. And you can see that it multiplies it by 12 to turn it from a monthly value into an annual amount. All of these other expenses, and this is supposed to help kind of prompt you to know what are the actual expenses that you can count. And I tried to be as thorough as possible based off of the guidance that we've gotten from the IRS. So you won't fill out every one of these potentially, but maybe there's something on here that you didn't think of including before. And so you thought it's like, hey, I didn't think to include, for instance, my home warranty if you have one. If you work with me, then you know that there are waste of money and you wouldn't have one. But if you do, you can count it towards your housing allowance. So it makes it slightly less awful than they normally are. But we can go through and we can put in, let's say that annually we pay, $4,000 in property taxes. And for all of these, you can change them from annual to monthly if you want to. That 4,000 got added to that 24 and made it 28. If I turned it monthly, of course, this really inflates. But each of these you can toggle. It starts property taxes and insurance. We typically pay those annually or biannually. So I have those set to annual. And the rest of them I have as monthly expenses. So homeowners or renters insurance, let's say we're paying $600 a year on that. And now we have the monthly utilities, let's say $90 for that. Let's say we're paying about $250 a month for electricity and things like that. We don't have a home warranty. Say we have a security system that costs us $75 a month. Let's say our internet costs us $85. Yard maintenance, let's say we're paying $120 for that. Home maintenance and repairs. Again, you can go back. I'll show you the system by which we track all of this stuff. But if you just wanted to set aside some money and have it on the side, it's probably a good idea. Put it in your emergency fund. Let's just say we have 100 set aside for repairs and 100 set aside for improvements. If you live in a homeowners association, you can put the dues in here. Furniture and appliance, again, you can set aside just $100 for when you have to replace your furniture if you want. And then if there's anything else that you're confident fits into housing expenses that isn't particularly here, you can put an explanation here and you can put the dollar amount here. So what this tool does is this aggregates everything up into an annual total. And so these are your housing expenses for the year. This is one of those legs on the three-legged stool for whatever year that you're doing. So this is already worlds above what most pastors have at their disposal. Usually they're like pulling out receipts and doing all that kind of stuff, or they're just estimating or saying, I think it's probably about 35,000 for the year. That's not going to pass an audit. So we want to have something a little bit more concrete than this. So that'll help with that. So that's how we figure out one of the legs. Let's figure out one of the other legs of the stool, and that's the rent estimates. All right, this is going to be fun. So I have two kind of sections here. We have one section for unfurnished rent estimates, and then we have one for furnished rent estimates. And I have this set to essentially take the higher one because there's no reason for your housing allowance to be artificially dampened by an inaccurate or a low rent estimate. All right, this is the one that we want it to be as high as is feasible, right? We don't want to break the rules. We want to stay within the confines of what the IRS is telling us is kosher. but there's no reason to make this artificially low and make one of the legs of our stool smaller than it has to be. So I have a couple things that I want to show here. Redfin.com and Zillow.com are two websites that provide, if you live in an urban area, they provide pretty good rent estimates. If you have like a custom home or you live out in a rural area, you may have to take it with a grain of salt. It might be a good idea to maybe get something like a broker price opinion, or get a realtor to come look at it and give you sort of a rent estimate based off of their own comp analysis. But for most people, again, if you live in a city, they'll be able to pull pretty good comps, and Redfin and Zillow will give you pretty good estimates. So I'm going to show you right now where we pull it from. And then we have a third one down here. Furnishedfinder.com is another website. And what's powerful about this is that this actually shows you furnished properties that are for rent. And so you can see that there's a premium for a furnished apartment versus an unfurnished apartment or a home. The way that we handle it here with the unfurnished estimate is we take whatever Redfin and Zillow gives us, and we're going to add about a 20% furnished rental premium. I have a little source here that you can read. This is an article that talks about, in general, you can expect a 15 to 20% premium for a furnished property versus an unfurnished property. And so we're just going to take the unfurnished rent estimate, which is what we get from Redfin and Zillow, and we're going to multiply that by 20%. And so that's going to give us kind of a furnished version of the rent estimate that we get from Zillow. And then the next thing we do is we add in the utility costs. It automatically adds in the utility costs that we put in up here. It pulls out your utilities, your electricity, everything, internet, everything that constitutes as utilities under the IRS definition. It automatically calls those down and pulls them here, and then it adds it to that estimate. All right. So let's go ahead and just jump over. I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and instead I'm going to share my Zillow screen. All right, so I've chosen, this is a random house. If you happen to live in this house, I'm so sorry. But this is in my hometown of Fresno, California. And I picked a property that is actually listed for rent. So that's kind of where this came from. So this particular property, all the information is here on Zillow. This is a 4-bedroom and 3-bath house at about 2,000 square feet. It's really nice because it has the basic information that you need, kind of right here, right at the front, right? So because we're going to look for comps, we're going to be looking for properties that are similar to this. Now, if I do a Control F and I look for rent estimate, it just shows up right here. Zillow has it right here at the top. Estimated rent is $28.46 right there. So Zillow says that if you were to rent this, again, unfurnished, you should be able to rent it for about $2,846 a month. All right, so we're going to keep that in mind. I'm going to head over to Redfin, which is, again, another property address. I have this same property pulled up on Redfin. They have a similar rent estimate. They have a slightly different algorithm, so they're going to be different values. I like taking both of them and taking the higher one because, if Redfin or Zillow says it, then, we're going to say that that's good enough for us. So again, let's do a Control Enter and let's look for rent. They're asking $29.95, but I think if we hit show more, we should be able to see what their actual rent estimate is. So again, we can keep them honest. Nearby rentals. Price of this rental. Okay, again, that's the $29.95 that they're asking for. Redfin should have their own rent estimate. Here it is, rental estimate for this particular property. They say that it should be $25.14 a month, right? Okay, so going back to Zillow, they said $28.46, and Redfin says $25.14. All right, so let's go ahead and put both of these back into the tool. There it is. Okay, and I'm going to put the date I accessed it. So today's date when I actually went to that website, because websites are changing all the time. Again, this helps you with documentation. Extra credit, you could even print out that page as a PDF, slip it into your tax folder on your computer or what have you, and you can have even more documentation showing. So today is the 26th of August. It's our very first live stream here. And again, I did them both on the same day, 2025. All right. So to remind myself, Redfin said that it was 2514. And Zillow said that it should be 2846. There we have it. All right, so you can see that it automatically propagates all this down. It multiplies it by 12 to move it from a monthly to an annual. It adds that 20% furnished rental premium like we talked about, and then it adds in the estimated utility costs. And so the fair rental value in IRS language for the purposes of your housing allowance for this house is estimated according to this methodology at $45,062. So I think this is a totally fine number to use. Again, we went to established estimates. We did an established methodology for adding a furnished rental premium. We took your actual utility costs and we added them in there. I think this is a very defensible number. And so that's what this does. And comparing it to our actual housing expenses of $39,640, we're not too far off. And it is good to see the fair rental value higher than the actual housing expenses. If it was lower than the expenses, then that shows that you have sort of, you're capping out your housing allowance and you're spending more. And so there are some housing expenses that you're not getting the benefit for. So my answer to that would be maybe we can find a way to cut expenses for the housing on the housing side. Maybe it's artificially inflated in a particular year because you bought a bunch of furniture, or you did some big home improvement project. Maybe you redid the kitchen or something like that. It cost you $20,000. You're obviously going to exceed your housing allowance for that year. There are some ways that we talk about in the book to plan ahead for that sort of thing, so that you can maybe spread out that benefit as much as you can and get maybe multiple years worth of housing allowance benefit and really maximize your tax benefit from that. Well, anyway, that's the housing summary portion of this tool. Again, you're tracking your actual housing expenses. You're getting your rent estimate. This number up here takes essentially the best of these both worlds. We didn't talk about Furnished Finder though, so let's go and talk about that. So again, I have this up. Let me go ahead and take off some of these things. All right, back to it. All right, here we go. So furnishedfinder.com is a fantastic resource for pastors who are looking to substantiate the fair rental value for their housing allowance. We showed one methodology using the unfurnished rents from Redfin and Zillow, multiplying them by 20% and then adding your utilities. Here we can look at what are actual furnished residents going for. And so maybe we can get a higher value looking at these. So let's go ahead and do that. Again, I'm looking at Fresno, California. This is my hometown. And I'm going to just leave all this the same. Filters, I'm going to look for the same kind of property. So if we remember, we want to take the entire place. We don't just want to rent out a single room. We want there to be a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom property. And I'm going to set these to exact match just to see if we get lucky. It looks like we do have 3 properties. And again, the other thing that we were looking at is we want something that's at least 2,000 square feet, because that's going to be in the ballpark. There are 3 that came up. Let's see where these are on the map. Okay, I know this area pretty well. This is going back to my real estate investing days, where we would look at comps and do all that sort of thing. The house that we're looking for is about in this area over here, kind of southeast of Tarpey Village. These places are all kind of spread out. Up here, this is in Clovis. This is kind of a nicer area, so I'm gonna knock that out. This seems like way out as well. This $3,200 per month for this place right here, I'm gonna go ahead and punch in here. I think even though this is a 3,000 square foot, I think the location of it makes it a pretty good comp. It's in a slightly worse area than the one that we were looking at, but it is bigger. It is a 4-bedroom, 3-bath house, and they're listing it for $3,200 a month. Um, so there's one more thing that we want to look at, because some of these on here do include utility costs. And if they do include utility costs, they will tell you that they do. Let me look at one other one. I think I looked at this one earlier. And this one, it says that utilities are included. There it is. So you can see the utilities are included in this one. And so we have a way in the tool to show whether utilities are included or not, because that's going to affect the total calculation of it. Okay, but let's go back to this one that we felt like, oops, there we go. This is the one. This is the one that we felt like was good, 3,200. I'm going to go back to the tool. I'm going to input this information. Back to the tool. There we are. Okay, comp from furnishedfinder.com. They said 3,200 a month. If utilities are included, we would put a number 1 here, and you would see that would zero out the estimated utility costs. Again, it's pulling it down from your actual utility costs that you put in above. This particular one, though, it said that it was not, so I'm going to take that out. And so Furnished Finder, the comp that we found, the total estimated came up with was 42,480. The one that we came up before, the 45,000, this is a better one. So it automatically is going to pull on this tool the higher the amounts that you can justify. And so that's how this works. It's possible that we could have found a comp that we felt like was better, that we could justify charging more rent for. But I think this shows that these are actually pretty darn close. And so I'm kind of happy with our methodology over here. It's showing that it's in line with what they're asking for rents for furnished properties, at least in my area. All right, so that's this first sheet. And again, you can print this out. You can slip it into your tax statement or in your tax folder for later. Let's go to the analysis tab that we didn't talk about before. So this essentially at a glance shows you visually the difference between the housing allowance that you could take based off of your fair rental value versus the actual housing cost that you have to justify it. And again, so this shows that you have on average, you have about a $452 a month leeway, if you will, of additional housing expenses that you could claim. And this could be useful when you're looking at, say, again, like one-time improvements, or you have like a one-time expense, you have to buy a new appliance, you have to buy new furniture. This will show you have up to $5,422-ish in the year that you can use for those kinds of improvements and still claim your full benefit. So this helps you maybe with some budgeting for those sorts of things. It's like maybe you need to do a $10,000 repair or a remodel of the house. If you have the luxury of timing it, maybe you do half of the repairs in December of one year. You take your $5,000 additional benefit there. You straddle the rest of them into January of the next year. You take your $5,000 benefit for that year, maximizing your allowance for both years. So that's kind of the thought process behind adding this in as a tool. And again, if we want to actually read the housing allowance request, it automatically brings in the amount requested. Where did this 41,000 come from, by the way? Let me break that down a little bit. So we have actual expenses of 39,600. We have rent estimates of 45,000. So where did that other value come from? What this tool does is it takes the lower of either your actual rent estimate or a 5% bump on your housing expenses. And the reason for that is that you want to right size your request. There are some things that you kind of write yourself off of if you request too high of a housing allowance. We already talked about the danger of underreporting your income and getting slapped with a big tax bill when it comes time to file, which is something that we would like to avoid. You also may not be able to, say, contribute to a Roth IRA. If your housing allowance is too high, it's a zero-sum game, right? And so that means that your actual reported wages get pushed lower. And so that, in order to contribute to a Roth IRA, you have to make money, you have to earn wages. And if those wages are artificially too low, you won't be able to contribute as much as maybe you would like to. So, that's another potential downside of asking for too much housing allowance. So that's what this tool is trying to do, is trying to ask for a good amount to where you're still within the bounds of your fair rental value. You're not asking for more than that because that's an absolute cap. But you're also not asking too much more than the actual housing expenses that you're anticipating paying. Again, if you are, and you can use your judgment here, if you know that you'll be spending more on your house this year on things like capital improvements or repairs or new furniture or a new lawn or things like that that are going to be an additional expense, you have every right to request the full 45,000 in this case as your housing allowance. You can do that. But this allowance request is helping you right size it so that you're not inflating your housing allowance beyond what you're likely to spend on it, and thus losing out on some of the wage specific benefits that you would get. So that's what that does. Reading through this just carefully, you can read this yourself later, but after careful consideration of my housing expenses, I'm requesting an amount indicated above, which is $41,622. That's a 5% bump on top of what our actual expenses are. I kindly ask the church board to approve this request. You sign your name and date it. The board a representative of the board, after they approve it, can sign their name and date it and give it back to you. Again, you take this and you slip it in with your taxes. It's all right there. So if you get audited, look, here's one of the legs of the stool. The board approved this housing allowance. Here are your actual housing expenses. That's the second leg of the stool. And look, here's my documentation for the fair rental value. There's the third leg of the stool. The three legs that keep you from failing an audit. And that's what we're doing. And again, we have a board resolution here. The same amount requested comes across here. And they can say, as adopted by the board of directors of the Big Happy Church, ministers are afforded a housing allowance. It is thereby resolved that the total compensation paid to Pastor John Doe will include $41,000 as a housing allowance for this year, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so that's the tool.